The US Secretary of Defence has arrived in Israel just days after talks restarted on reviving the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Joining me now live is political analyst at Curtin University, Professor Joe Siracusa. Professor, what does the US-Israel relationship look like under a Biden administration? Because Donald Trump was quite close to Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yeah, well, it's the same problem the United States has had with Israel for about 30 years, and that is to contain their enthusiasm about destroying their enemies. You know, in the past, if there was a nuclear reactor nearby, Israel just reserved the right to take it out, whether it would be Iran or Iraq, whatever. And whatever the United States wants to do with Iran, it has to do it in conjunction with Israeli defense needs. Now, the Israelis take a very, very hard view. They see the future of Iran's nuclear policy as very dangerous and as a basic threat to them. So they reserve the right to act. So the United States is always very mindful of what Israel is going to do or not going to do. So, you know, the visit to Israel would be the same as any other visit. It's to settle them down and to get them on the same page, because the Biden administration, which needs some kind of a victory in foreign policy because it's not doing well in other places, wants to cut this deal with the Iranians. So it's going to be harder and harder to do because President Trump put in about 1,600 new sanctions that have to be peeled away. And the Iranians naively think that the Americans can just slip back to the high table and business as usual in exchange for sanctions. They'll control their enrichment policies. And so, but that's not exactly happening, and the window's closing. But the important thing is to keep Israel on side. Keep in mind, Danica, Israel has no defense, has no security treaty with the United States, though they could always count on each other. And the United States has always been very anxious to sort of mute the Israeli response to a number of American initiatives, because Israel will go its own way, and it did with Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger when it decided to pursue nuclear weapons. Today, Israel has 80 nuclear weapons and fissile material for 200 more. So, you know, they've gone their own way, and they're calling the shots in the Middle East, and they don't want any other competitors in the nuclear area.
You mentioned that the US would be trying to get Israel on side through these talks, but what does the resumption of the nuclear deal talks mean for Israel?
Well, Israel's already said what they're going to do. They've attacked a tanker in the Red Sea, which is an Iranian spy ship, or at least the mothership for their Revolutionary Guard. And I saw on Reuters this morning that the Iranians have reported nuclear terrorism at the Natanz plant, the nuclear plant. So and it's clearly this is Israel in both cases, because Biden wouldn't have done this. So I think Israel is saying one thing and doing another. I mean, it just they're very, very uneasy about this. I mean, nuclear weapons, Danica, are about buying time until these weapons become anachronistic, but the Israelis don't see it this way. They see any neighbor like Iran with a nuclear weapon as an existential threat, though that phrase is probably overworn. But no, they're not going to tolerate it, and I think you know, they've already attacked the base or the plant yesterday and the ship a couple of days ago. So they're just going to be sending out their own messaging. And so whatever the Americans do, they want them to do it very moderately. But I tell you what, I think the Israelis are in a position to spoil the whole deal. I mean, the whole thing may go off the boil, because you know, the Iranians can't wait too long here. Rouhani, the president there, has to come up with something fairly shortly. He's considered a moderate, but in Iran, there really are no moderates. There are hardliners and not so hardliners. And they've got to get those sanctions off the table. And the Americans are going to be very slow to do this, particularly if Israel is not forthcoming.